I know what you want. I know what you want.
No, we are not talking about Metallica. We are talking Creeping Death from 2023. And this is written, directed and stars Matt Sampere, a young filmmaker. And what does he come up with? Well, it's a kind of Halloween slasher movie. But what attracted me to this movie, for me to watch it at least, was one of its co-stars, that being Monique Parent, who was a somewhat well-known screen queen back in the day, and has also done a bunch of these kind of erotic thrillers, and I've reviewed a couple of her movies, so I was intrigued to see her in this one. But also it's obviously a fun-sounding premise, almost like kind of like a throwback movie in some ways, to a simpler time, a time of the 80s, a time of slasher, the time of just kind of somewhat straightforward horror movies. And that's what this one is. So what is the story? Well, it focuses on a group of young adults as they pull a Halloween prank on this kind of old guy and steal something that is outside his house. But this actually is an offering to some type of demonic entity which takes umbrage with these young adults who have now stolen this offering and decides it's going to take these lives instead. Take the lives of these young people. And they have to try and figure out a way, if they can, to stop this thing. What will happen? You will have to watch the movie and find out. So this is a low budget movie, and our filmmaker here seems relatively young, but I do think it's somewhat kind of competently put together for a clearly quite young filmmaker, and also obviously the fact this is a kind of a low budget. It is very much a kind of love letter to the horror movies of yesteryear. A simple plot, a kind of, group of kind of unruly young people, a masked unstoppable killer. Yes, you've heard this kind of song many times before. This is no way going to be accused of being original at any time soon, but it will kind of feel somewhat nostalgic possibly. And if you are a fan of those, style of films from like the 80s and early 90s, then there's a lot to kind of enjoy in this movie, I would suggest, because it does very much follow that kind of path. The killer, I have to say, is quite well realised. They've given him some backstory and kind of tied it into actual kind of Halloween lore, if that makes sense, and tie it into trick-or-treating and things like this. He kind of looks quite cool. He's got an imposing look, this kind of almost pumpkin sort of style head, which I think is quite, quite spooky looking. I sort of like the build up to a degree, where we have these sort of strange runes kind of painted on people's doors that have been visited, so to speak, by this kind of entity. It gives it this kind of spooky serial killer vibe almost too, before we actually learn that it is actually some type of kind of supernatural entity. Now, one thing I would say is that there are some fairly kind of gruesome deaths. I wouldn't say necessarily graphic. I mean, we do see some guts and things being pulled out, but the actual deaths themselves are quite gruesome in the fact that, we're getting heads squished, guts pulled out, things like that, and there is there is practical effects on display here, but just the suggestion of what's happening, because sometimes we don't see everything, it gives it some kind of very violent kind of deaths and some sort of quite gruesome wounds and things like that these are kind of young people are having inflicted upon them. Once the killer is set free and is on the loose, it's pretty much non-stop from that kind of point. And I do think the movie tries to have a degree of morality and a little bit of kind of questions of what would be best for the greater good, if that makes sense. Is it better to kind of be super altruistic, or can you sacrifice one thing to kind of save another? And what would be the kind of the greater evil to a certain degree? So there is a few kind of moral questions there. I do have some problems with the cinematography, which we'll come on to, but what I would say is there are some shots here and some sequences that I do think are well put together, and it does have an element of you know, some time and some effort and some, you know, care that has been taken into the production to give, I think, for what is clearly a kind of a low budget movie, still some elements of kind of some decent kind of production, or at least some careful production. And there's a few artistic kind of shots that I kind of quite enjoyed with use of light and things like this, you know, that I think are quite good and give a kind of like macabre feel to this movie. But let's talk about the flip side of that. I think one of the critiques that probably some people will have here, the cinematography in general maybe is a little underlit at times, and it's kind of ends up making the film seem somewhat kind of dull. And uninteresting. Now, I'm not saying everything should be in neon lights, but you've got to find creative ways to make the film seem a little more dynamic. Be it there's a fire nearby where we can kind of, it's illuminating characters and things like this. At the moment, it's a little bit kind of dull. We're not talking Aliens versus Predator Requiem kind of issues here, but there is a little bit of work to be done in the cinematography, I would say. Other issues, I have to say, I think this movie, as well as maybe looking a little kind of drab at times, the movie doesn't really get starting until quite late in the film. We don't really get our first genuine kind of appearance from the killer until a good 50 minutes or so into the movie. And it's just not a super long movie. So I think the build-up was probably a little bit too long until we get to our you know, you're almost at the third act, to be honest with you, when this kind of the creature shows up. It's a little bit late in the game, if you ask me. The characters themselves, they are straight sort of stereotypical cliches. Now, this may have been done on purpose to kind of reference movies of the past and things like that, but nonetheless, it doesn't matter. That's how they kind of come across. You know, we've got the typical a-hole guy. You know who's going to be an a-hole later on in the movie, and sure enough. And I have to be honest with you, creator, I guess, writer, director, Matt Sampere, casting himself, I don't know if was the smart move here. He's given himself the most sympathetic part in the movie, and no disrespect to this guy, but acting is not his strong suit. I feel he should have concentrated behind the camera and given this role to maybe someone who is just concentrating on the acting, so to speak, because his acting isn't particularly strong. And to be honest with you, I wouldn't say this is like a class act in regards to acting just across the board. Some of them fare better than others, but it's all very kind of like typical stuff. I mean, the characters, as I say, are very cliche. And while some characters I think are fine, others are a little on the weaker side. But unfortunately, the standout here is our writer-director star, who's given himself the main leading role, and I have to say, I think he's lacking a little bit in the acting department, I'm sorry to say. And the overall film just has a over-familiarity in it. There's nothing really here that makes this movie stand out in any positive way, at least. It's fine. I mean, the best I can say with this film is there's some you know, fairly kind of good ideas in regards to things you've seen before done again, and the killer kind of looks cool, but even that is, again, there's shades of other franchises and things. So, you know, there's some elements that are fine and okay, but there are a few elements that I think are more detractors. And this will bring me to my score for this one, which will be a 4 out of 10. Now, overall, I think there is an entertainment value to be had here, if you're a fan of slashers. But I have to, if you look at you know, you add up the positives and negatives, it falls just under an average score for me. But it's still a watchable film if you like your old school slashers. There you go. 4 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.